The public never expected it, but some of America's own generals did the unthinkable. They faked battlefield victories, not for glory, not for fame, but to keep an entire nation from collapsing under the weight of despair. It was the darkest chapter of World War II, when defeat loomed over every trench, every map, every soldier's trembling heart. Yet, somehow, newspapers back home told a different story. Stories of triumph, of progress, of unstoppable American courage. But behind those headlines lay a truth too dangerous to reveal. Imagine soldiers fighting in the mud, believing they were part of a glorious victory, when, in reality, they'd been led into a theater of illusion. Imagine generals quietly rewriting reports, altering casualty numbers, inventing wins that never existed. Why would they do it? To protect morale, or to protect themselves? This is the story of deception, inside the very heart of command, a story hidden beneath classified files, censored radio transmissions, and staged battlefield photographs. And as we peel back the layers of this military mirage, one chilling question will echo through history. How many of those victories were real? Stay with me. The truth is darker than anyone ever imagined. The illusion of triumph. A desert wind cut through the American encampment like a blade. Dust hissed against canvas tents, the sky painted in a dull, merciless gold. It was 1943, North Africa, a place where dreams of victory came to die beneath the sun. The men of the 36th Infantry had fought for weeks, losing ground inch by inch. Their rations were thin, their spirits thinner, and yet, that morning, the radio crackled with a voice that didn't match the battlefield they stood on. Headquarters confirms, Allied forces have achieved major success along the Tunisian front. Enemy positions shattered. Advance continues. Sergeant James Weller stared at the transmitter, his face a mask of disbelief. Success. He looked around at the wounded men, the burned-out trucks, the silence of exhaustion. There was no victory here, only survival. Back in Washington, though, headlines were already being printed. Americans turned the tide. They screamed, "Enemy retreating." Photographs carefully staged, cropped, and brightened, showed smiling soldiers waving flags in the desert. The public cheered. Factories roared louder. War bonds sold like wildfire. The illusion worked. But behind closed doors, the architects of that illusion sat in quiet rooms, wrestling with a dangerous truth. The war was going badly, far worse than the public could ever be allowed to know. General Dwight Eisenhower.com yet burdened. Read through casualty reports that contradicted the official victories broadcast to the world. Losses were higher, supplies dwindling. The enemy wasn't retreating, they were regrouping, and yet, his political superiors demanded results. A victory, any victory, to keep morale alive. A colonel leaned forward in that dim-lit command tent. "Sir, if the people think we're losing, we risk collapse. The soldiers, they'll start believing it too." Eisenhower's silence stretched like a held breath. Finally, he said quietly, "Then they must not think we're losing." And just like that, the illusion began. Orders were given to adjust reports before they reached the press. Advances replaced retreats. Tactical delays replaced defeats. Even small skirmishes, moments of confusion in the desert, were written up as triumphs of strategy. To the public, the U.S. Army looked unstoppable. To those in the field, it felt like living in a theater where the script never matched reality. One night, a war correspondent named Harold Kane stumbled upon a chilling truth. While traveling with the 5th Armored, he overheard officers rewriting a dispatch. A loss near Kasserine Pass was transformed into a successful defensive maneuver. When he confronted them, a captain told him coldly, "You'll print what you're told, son. You want mothers back home to keep believing their boys are winning, don't you?" Kane hesitated. He thought of the families reading his stories, clinging to every word for hope. And then, slowly, he nodded. That night, he filed the story as ordered. American armor repels enemy assault. But the truth was that the 5th Armored had been shattered. Weeks later, the first real victory came not on the battlefield, but in the press. Morale surged. Recruitment climbed. Factories worked around the clock. Washington noticed. "It's working," one advisor said. "The people believe again." From then on, a new kind of weapon entered the war. Not guns or tanks, but headlines. Stage-managed photographs, inspired letters home, and patriotic radio broadcasts replaced cold facts. America was winning, because America had to believe it was winning. Yet not everyone agreed with the deception. In London, An intelligence officer named Miriam Shaw began tracking inconsistencies between American field reports and intercepted German communications. The Germans often described massive Allied losses in battles that US newspapers celebrated as glorious victories. Something didn't add up. She wrote a confidential memo to her superior. If these reports are falsified for morale, it may endanger operations. Command decisions based on false victories could be catastrophic. Her warning was ignored. Meanwhile, deep in the Tunisian hills, soldiers noticed a strange pattern. Orders came based on successful advances that hadn't happened. Units were sent to reinforce imaginary gains. Men marched toward objectives already lost. Confusion spread. The left hand didn't know what the right hand had invented. One cold dawn, Sergeant Weller's unit received an order to secure previously won territory. They looked at each other in disbelief. Previously won. The map showed red pins marking liberated positions, but when they arrived, German artillery greeted them. The area was not liberated. It had never been. Half his men were cut down before the radio could even confirm the mistake. When the survivors limped back, command classified the encounter as unexpected resistance during mop-up operations. Weller laughed bitterly when he heard it. "Mop-up," he muttered, staring at the empty stretch of desert. "That's what they call our dead now." Back home, the same event appeared in the papers as American valor in the final push. It was around this time that whispers began spreading through the ranks. Soldiers joked darkly about fighting in the imaginary army. "Maybe next week," one private said, "we'll win a city we've never seen." Laughter followed. Uneasy, hollow laughter, but something else was stirring. A rumor that a handful of generals were planning to take the illusion further. If fake victories could boost morale, could they also manipulate the enemy? Could a deception big enough confuse not just the public, but the Axis itself? Late in the spring of 1943, Eisenhower met secretly with British intelligence officers in a dusty villa outside Algiers. The plan on the table was bold. Stage entire operations that didn't exist, using fake radio chatter, inflatable tanks, and forged documents. The line between propaganda and warfare blurred into something darker. As night fell, an officer leaned in and whispered, "Sir, once we cross this line, there's no going back. Even our own men might not know what's real anymore." Eisenhower looked out toward the flickering oil lamps beyond the tent flap. He spoke softly, "Then we'll make them believe what we need them to believe." And so began the era of phantom victories. Victories fought on paper, broadcast through static, celebrated across oceans, and yet never truly won. Somewhere out in the dunes, Sergeant Weller's unit received another message. "Enemy retreating, hold position." The men smiled weakly, relief flickering in their eyes, but as they listened closer, they realized something strange. The same message repeated, every hour, word for word, like a recording. That night, as they huddled under the endless sky, Weller whispered, "What if we're not the heroes they think we are? What if the war we're winning isn't real at all?" The wind answered with silence. And far away, in a Washington office, a general signed another report declaring complete victory in North Africa. But one line in the document stood out, stamped in red ink, buried in the margins. Public version, release immediately. Next to it, a smaller note, scribbled in pencil, internal actual outcome withheld until further notice. The illusion was complete, but it had already begun to consume the men who created it. And as America celebrated, another battle was brewing, not on the front lines, but in the war rooms themselves, where truth was the first casualty. The curtain of illusion was rising, but what lay behind it would soon shock the world. The morale machine it began in quiet rooms filled with cigarette smoke and typewriters. While soldiers bled on foreign soil, another kind of army was being assembled, one armed not with rifles, but with pens, cameras, and film reels. Washington called it the Morale Division, but to those inside it, the name carried an unspoken truth. Their job was not to report the war. Their job was to shape it. The idea was simple. Wars were not only fought with bullets, they were fought with belief. If belief died, the front would crumble. So the generals ordered a new campaign, one that would never appear in any official record. Operation Optimism. Some officers jokingly called it. Its goal was not to defeat the enemy, but to convince the American people that victory was inevitable, no matter the cost. In truth, newsreel crews were granted access to special zones, where staged scenes were filmed using soldiers too wounded to fight, but well enough to stand for a few frames. Tanks that had broken down days earlier were rolled into position and filmed from low angles to look unstoppable. A colonel from the propaganda unit would whisper directions: "Hold the flag higher, smile, we'll fix the smoke in editing." By the time the footage reached American theaters, the crowds cheered. The headlines matched the images perfectly. "American might unbroken." The illusion grew legs, spreading faster than the truth ever could. Harold Kane, the same war correspondent who'd once filed falsified stories from North Africa, now worked inside this new propaganda hub. He tried to believe it was for the greater good, that morale was as vital as ammunition. But the further he looked behind the curtain, the less he could justify what he saw. One evening, he was handed a sealed folder marked Top Priority Europe Front. Inside were photographs of soldiers celebrating under a flag. He recognized one of them, Private Duggan, a young man Kane had interviewed weeks before. But Duggan had died during the Sicilian landings. Yet here he was, smiling, alive, immortalized as the face of victory. Kane confronted the photo editor, who simply shrugged. "We recycled old shots. No one will notice." That night, Kane sat alone in his quarters, staring at Duggan's picture. He thought about the mother who would see it and believe her son lived long enough to taste victory. He whispered, "We're feeding them ghosts." Meanwhile, in London, Miriam Shaw's reports were growing louder. Her intercepted messages painted a grim contrast. German intelligence had begun using the American morale machine to their advantage. They studied the fake victories, analyzed the tone of broadcasts, and deduced where the Allies wanted them to believe success was happening. It was clever. They turned the deception back on its creators. One message sent to Berlin read, "Allied public morale artificially high, suggests cover for upcoming failure in Italy." Within weeks, German reinforcements poured into the exact region the Allies were secretly preparing to invade. When the landing began, they walked straight into an ambush. The illusion that once protected morale had now begun killing soldiers. Eisenhower received the casualty. Reports in silence. Across from him, a communications officer shifted uneasily. "Sir, the press release says it was a limited success." Eisenhower closed his eyes. "Then that's what it was." His aide hesitated. "But, sir, morale can't win a war." Eisenhower opened his eyes, cold and weary. "Neither can despair." Outside the command post, reporters gathered, waiting for the day's update. They were handed a statement declaring steady progress across the Italian front. When one journalist asked about losses, the spokesperson smiled faintly. "All wars have their costs," he said, "but America is on the march." Behind that facade, dissent began to whisper through the ranks. Some officers demanded an end to the fabrications. Others argued the truth could destroy what little unity remained. The press became divided. Those who told the story they were given, and those who tried to find the story that was hidden. Kane, now disillusioned, tried to smuggle one honest report through. He described the failed landings, the chaos, the bodies floating near the shore. His editor tore it up in front of him. "Do you want mothers to stop sending their sons to fight? Do you want factories to stop building? We are not liars, Harold, we're guardians of hope." But Kane couldn't shake the thought, when hope demands lies, what is it guarding anymore? Days later, a coded message arrived from Miriam Shaw. She'd traced one of the false victories all the way to its origin, a communications hub in Algiers, where morale transmissions were being produced daily. These weren't battlefield reports. They were scripts, entire battles written before they even happened. One report described a triumph near Naples, yet, at the time it was written, no troops had even landed there. The victories were being fabricated in advance. Kane traveled to Algiers under the pretense of a press assignment. What he found made his stomach twist. In a nondescript building, dozens of operators typed furiously, taking orders from military liaisons. Every hour, new updates were sent to Washington, all marked with the same phrase, "Field confirmed." He overheard one officer joke, "We're winning so fast, I can't keep up." When he confronted a major about the falsifications, the man didn't flinch. "Do you have any idea what a single story of defeat does to the stock market, to enlistment numbers? This isn't about truth, it's about survival." Kane left that night, his faith in his country's leadership shattered, but before he could publish his findings, his credentials were revoked. His stories never made print again. Weeks later, American radio broadcast a stirring victory announcement. U.S. forces liberate Naples. The enemy flees. Crowds celebrated in Times Square. But in reality, Naples was still under bombardment. The so-called victory had been written a week earlier in that Algiers room. Miriam listened to the same broadcast from her London post. Her hands trembled as she decoded new enemy intercepts. The Germans had intercepted the fake liberation message before it was released to the public, and used it to set up a counterattack. The illusion was now costing not just credibility, but thousands of lives. Inside the Allied war councils, tempers flared. "We can't keep lying to the people," one general shouted. "Sooner or later, the truth will crawl out of the ground." Eisenhower stood silent for a long moment. Then he spoke softly. "If we stop now, the war stops with us." Outside, the rain pounded against the windows. The sound mixed with the clattering of typewriters in the next room, the morale machine still humming, still printing victory after victory. But somewhere in the chain, a mistake had already been made. A coded message, one not meant for public eyes, was about to reach the wrong hands. A clerk, half asleep at his desk, sent a transmission using the wrong cipher key. It was supposed to go to a classified Allied network. Instead, it was broadcast on an open frequency, the same one used by international correspondents. Within hours, a London reporter received it, a complete internal memo admitting that several recent American victories were, in truth, morale operations. If that document reached the public, the illusion would collapse overnight. The generals scrambled to contain it. Newspapers were pressured, lines were cut, reporters silenced. But the message had already traveled too far. Copies began to circulate in underground channels. Kane, now living in near exile, received one such copy. He read it by candlelight, his eyes scanning the words he had long suspected were true. Victory reports, adjusted for public reassurance. Casualties downplayed, operations prescripted for morale. He whispered, almost to himself, "It's over. The truth is out." But then came the sound, a knock at his door. 3 slow raps. He froze. Another knock, louder this time. When he opened it, 2 military policemen stood there, rain dripping from their coats. One held an envelope. "Mr. Kane," the taller one said, "you're needed in Washington. The generals would like to speak with you, privately." Kane's pulse quickened. He looked down at the document still in his hand, the proof of everything. He folded it quietly and slipped it inside his coat. "Of course," he said softly. "Let's go." As the car pulled away into the storm, he glanced back through the rain-smeared window, watching the dim light of his room fade into darkness. He had no idea that by morning, that document would vanish, and so would he. Ghost reports and phantom Eunice rain lashed against the windows of the Pentagon like the drumming of impatient fingers. Inside, under flickering fluorescent light, a small group of men gathered around a map so large it covered an entire wall. Red and blue pins dotted Europe like a fever spreading across the continent. The war was at its boiling point. Every inch of ground meant lives. Every mistake meant coffins. General Chester Donovan, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, traced a finger across northern France. "We can't afford another morale collapse," he said, voice low. "The Italians are faltering. The British are stretched thin. We need the enemy to believe we're everywhere, even when we're not." A young intelligence officer, thin and pale from too many sleepless nights, hesitated before speaking. "You're suggesting?" "Fake divisions." Donovan looked up. "Not fake, invisible." The room fell silent. The idea was madness. Yet, in wartime, madness often passed for strategy. Within days, the Ghost Army was born. Its mission, to create entire divisions out of nothing. Inflatable tanks, recorded sounds of moving troops, dummy encampments painted to fool aerial reconnaissance, and the most dangerous part, falsified reports designed to appear authentic to both the enemy and the press, to the public. These would become the victories that never happened. To the Germans, they would become the armies that didn't exist. But the lines between the two were beginning to blur in London. Miriam Shaw studied the new intelligence updates coming in from the American High Command. They were unlike anything she'd seen before. Reports of massive troop buildups in areas where no Allied forces were actually stationed. At first, she assumed it was a mistake, but the more she checked, the stranger it became. German reconnaissance seemed to confirm what was impossible. Thousands of soldiers marching through fields that, in truth, were empty. Someone had built an army of shadows, and the enemy believed in it. But so did the American public. Newspapers began printing stories about divisions moving with unstoppable force, surrounding the enemy, preparing for decisive victory. Kane's missing reports had been replaced by a new wave of exclusive accounts, written by journalists who'd never set foot near the front. And then came the first real miracle of deception, Operation Fortitude. Through fake radio transmissions and carefully leaked reports, the Allies made the Germans believe the D-Day invasion would happen in Calais, not Normandy. Inflatable tanks lined the English coast, guarded by actors dressed as officers. Even General Patton, the most feared man in the US Army, was turned into part of the charade. His movements, his commands, all part of the illusion. When the real invasion struck Normandy, the German forces were caught off guard, their armies held back in the wrong place. The deception worked flawlessly. For the generals, it was proof that illusion could win wars. For the propagandists, it was the ultimate justification. If lies can save lives, one advisor said proudly, then we've done our duty. But not everyone shared that pride. Miriam, buried in the secret intelligence files, noticed something chilling. After the success of Fortitude, the Morale Division began using the same tactics internally. They created ghost reports of progress in areas where the fighting was still brutal or stagnant. Victories that hadn't yet been earned were broadcast to the world as if they were history. Entire divisions that never existed appeared on paper. The 14th Airborne, the 39th Armored, even a Pacific detachment supposedly pushing through Burma. They had names, insignias, casualty counts. They even received letters of commendation. But in reality, they were ghosts, tools of deception designed to sustain an illusion that America's might was endless. Meanwhile, Harold Kane sat in a dim military office in Washington, guarded day and night. Since his mysterious return, he'd been promised an opportunity to contribute to the war effort. What he found instead was a cage lined with typewriters. Each day, he was handed transcripts, reports, headlines, and casualty updates, and told to adjust the narrative. His words no longer reached the public. They were filtered, reshaped, and published under someone else's name. He had become part of the very machine he'd tried to expose. One afternoon, a guard slipped him a folded scrap of paper, whispering quickly before walking away, "Someone in London's still fighting for you." Inside was a single name, Miriam Shaw. Kane felt a spark of life for the first time in months. Maybe someone still cared about the truth. Maybe the illusion hadn't consumed everyone yet. But Miriam was already in danger. She had begun sending reports directly to British Parliament officials, warning them that the Americans were fabricating intelligence, not just for the enemy's eyes, but for their own. Her message was clear. False confidence is more deadly than any bomb. Then, one night, her office was broken into. Files were taken. The next morning, her clearance was revoked. Officially, she was reassigned. Unofficially, she'd been silenced. The walls were closing in for everyone who knew too much. Back at the Pentagon, General Donovan reviewed a new set of casualty reports. Numbers had been adjusted again, this time, to keep the illusion of constant victory alive. "We've lost fewer men this month," an aide said proudly. Donovan didn't reply. He knew the truth. Losses were higher than ever. The illusion was devouring reality, report by report, name by name. But illusions have a strange habit. They demand to be believed. Soon, field commanders began making decisions based on the false reports. Reinforcements sent to secure captured areas vanished into ambushes. Supplies were diverted to phantom units. The deception that had fooled the enemy now turned against its creators. In late 1944, one such ghost victory near the Ardennes convinced high command that the front was stable. Weeks later, the Germans launched a devastating counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands died in a storm of snow and fire, caught unprepared because of reports that were never real. When news of the disaster reached Washington, chaos erupted. The morale machine scrambled to rewrite the event, as unexpected resistance met with fierce American valor. Even as soldiers froze and bled in the forests of Belgium, the papers back home showed smiling faces under victory banners. Miriam read one of those papers from her safe house in Oxford. She felt sick. The illusion was too big to stop now, too powerful. It had escaped its makers, and somewhere, in a guarded room in Washington, Harold Kane finished writing another official report. His hands trembled as he typed the final line. He paused, then added a sentence he wasn't authorized to write. "The truth has gone missing, like the men who once told it." He slipped a carbon copy of the report into his coat when no one was watching. That night, as he was being escorted back to his quarters, he saw something outside the window of the convoy, trucks moving under the moonlight, carrying dozens of strange, rounded shapes under tarps. For a moment, he thought they were artillery. Then, as a tarp fluttered loose, he saw it. Rubber, inflatable tanks, ghosts. Still marching to realization hit him like cold water. The illusion wasn't ending with the war. It was evolving. He looked toward the horizon, where thunder rolled over Washington, and whispered to himself, "They're not just faking battles anymore. They're rewriting history." The convoy stopped. The door opened. "End of the line, Mr. Kane," said the guard. But as Kane stepped out into the rain, he noticed something in the man's eyes, fear, and in that split second, he understood. The ghosts they had created were no longer under anyone's control. When lies turned deadly, the first snow of winter fell over Europe like a shroud, quiet and deceptive. It covered the wreckage, the blood, the broken helmets lying half buried in the mud. Somewhere in that frozen silence, truth was dying. By late 1944, the illusion had grown too powerful to contain. The American public believed total victory was inevitable. The newspapers told them so. The generals told them so. Even the soldiers at the front began repeating it like prayer. "We're winning," they said, even when surrounded, even when outnumbered, even when no help came. But belief cannot stop bullets. At a field hospital near Bastogne, a young nurse named Evelyn Carter wiped snow from her patient's face. His uniform was torn, blood frozen into its seams. He gripped her wrist weakly and whispered, "They told us it was over. They said the enemy was retreating." His voice faded. She didn't answer. She had heard that same line 100 times. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted like a nightmare. No one expected, not because intelligence failed, but because it had been falsified. The reports said the region was stable. Reinforcements had been redirected elsewhere, to phantom fronts that existed only in the pages of the Morale Division. By the time command realized the truth, the German panzers were already rolling through the Ardennes. In Washington, panic rippled through the War Department. The illusion that had once lifted spirits now threatened to destroy the entire front. General Donovan stared at the casualty numbers and muttered, "We were fighting ghosts, while the enemy was fighting men." The press demanded answers. How had the enemy managed to surprise the most powerful army on earth? The official statement came within hours. Unexpected enemy resistance, Allied forces responding heroically. Behind those polished words, chaos reigned. In London, Miriam Shaw received coded reports confirming her worst fears. The fake victories, the doctored radio messages, the phantom divisions, they'd blinded their own commanders. The war of deception had turned inward. She began compiling every intercepted message, every altered dispatch she could find, building what she called the ledger of lies. If the truth was ever to survive, it had to be recorded, but each new entry came with risk. Agents had started disappearing. Anyone too close to the truth simply vanished. One night, she found her office door ajar, her files scattered across the floor. A single note lay on her desk. "Stop digging. Ghosts don't like being seen." Meanwhile, Harold Kane sat inside a military compound in Virginia, still under watch, still writing propaganda he no longer believed. But something inside him had changed. The quiet compliance was gone. He had the carbon copy of the last report. He'd hidden proof that the military's successes were being scripted. He knew he couldn't print it, not yet, but he could send it, under the pretext of mailing Christmas letters to soldiers abroad. He slipped one envelope into the outgoing military mail. Inside, he placed his copy of the report and a note addressed to M. Shaw, London. He didn't know if it would ever reach her, but it was a risk worth taking. 2 weeks later, as the war in Europe reached its bloodiest winter, Miriam received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Kane's handwriting, unmistakable. "They're building a victory out of corpses," it read. "If the people knew what we've done, they'd stop believing in everything." She folded the letter and stared out her window. Snow drifted against the glass, soft and indifferent. "Then it's time they knew," she whispered. But telling the truth during wartime was a crime. The Morale Division had already begun hunting for leaks. Newspapers were monitored, mail intercepted, phones tapped. Still, Miriam pressed on, working with a small circle of British officers who believed the deception had gone too far. Together, they planned to expose the doctored reports through neutral channels, Swiss press, underground radio, even sympathetic diplomats. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Then, on January 12, 1945, disaster struck. A transport convoy carrying her documents to a neutral courier was bombed outside Antwerp. Officially, it was blamed on enemy aircraft, but witnesses later swore they saw no planes that night, only a single American fighter, flying without lights. The ledger of lies burned in the wreckage. The next morning, Miriam was declared missing. Some said she fled to Switzerland. Others claimed she was arrested and silenced. No one ever saw her again. Back in Washington, Kane learned of her disappearance through a coded note slipped under his door. 2 words only: she's gone. For hours, he sat motionless, the room dark, except for the dim orange glow of a single lamp. Finally, he stood, tore up his clearance badge, and walked out. He didn't make it far. Military police caught him near the gates. When they searched his room later, they found nothing: no papers, no letters, no copy of the report. It had vanished. But 2 days later, a strange article appeared in a small, independent newspaper in Lisbon. It claimed that US generals had been inflating victories and concealing defeats to maintain morale. No sources were named, no proof provided, yet the story spread, whispered in cafes, printed in underground leaflets, carried by rumor across oceans. The War Department dismissed it immediately. Enemy propaganda, they said. Lies meant to divide us. But behind closed doors, officials weren't so sure. The details were too precise. Someone inside had talked. General Donovan summoned his senior officers to a private meeting. "We can't afford a scandal," he warned. "The war's almost over. The truth stays buried." "Understood," a junior officer, voice trembling, asked. "And after the war, sir?" Donovan looked out the window toward the Capitol, its white dome gleaming in the pale sun. "After the war," he said softly, "people will only remember the victories we give them." In Europe, the snow began to thaw, revealing the battlefield beneath the wrecks of tanks, the frozen bodies, the shattered towns. Reporters were finally allowed to visit the front lines. What they found didn't match the triumphs they'd printed for months. One correspondent wrote privately to his editor, "If this is what victory looks like, I fear what defeat might have been." By April 1945, as Germany collapsed and the world cheered, the illusion reached its final act. Victory parades erupted across America, streamers falling from skyscrapers, brass bands echoing through the streets. But behind the cheers, a different set of orders circulated quietly through the military archives. Destroy all non-public field records. Archive alternate versions only. The cleanup had begun. Somewhere in a warehouse outside Washington, clerks fed paper after paper into furnaces. Reports of lost divisions, failed assaults, inflated numbers, all gone in smoke. Truth itself was being cremated. In the corner of that same warehouse, an old box sat unopened. Its label was faded, but one name was still legible: H. Kane. Inside were his notes, his drafts, and a single photograph of Miriam Shaw. On the back, he had written one line: "History is only what the victors choose to remember." Outside, the fire roared louder, and the light swallowed the last of his words. The war was ending, but the illusion, the great American myth of unbroken triumph, was just beginning. And somewhere, buried under the ashes of war, the truth waited for someone brave enough to dig it up. The great cover-up war had ended, but not the silence. Cities smoldered, Europe lay broken, and yet across America, the air was filled with celebration. Flags fluttered, brass bands thundered, and parades rolled through streets lined with cheering faces. Victory had arrived, glorious, unstoppable, American. But somewhere behind those victory parades, in windowless rooms beneath the War Department, the real battle was only beginning. It was no longer a war for territory. It was a war for memory. In the spring of 1946, General Chester Donovan sat alone in his office, staring at a mountain of classified reports stacked on his desk. His hair had turned gray, his shoulders heavier. The papers in front of him told a different story of World War II, one the public would never read. For every declared victory, there was an asterisk. For every heroic headline, a redacted truth. He turned one report over and found the signature of a familiar name at the bottom: Harold Kane. Donovan frowned. Kane's file had been closed a year ago, officially missing, unofficially erased. Yet here his handwriting was scrawled across a document that should have been destroyed. "Lies win wars," it read, "but they can't keep peace." Outside, the world was rebuilding, but in the halls of government, something darker was happening. Operation Clean Slate, a post-war directive, ordered the destruction or cessation of all classified materials that could damage the image of Allied integrity. It wasn't about national security anymore. It was about national mythology. Archivists worked around the clock, burning entire collections of field reports and psychological warfare files. Only a few people in the building knew what was being erased: the documents that detailed fabricated victories, falsified communications, and the deaths concealed beneath patriotic headlines. In London, amid the ruins of the old war offices, a single woman watched the world celebrate and felt only emptiness. Miriam Shaw had survived, though barely. She had escaped through Switzerland, smuggling out fragments of her ledger of lies. They were incomplete, damaged by smoke and rain, but enough to prove the truth. The Allied command had staged not just operations, but entire histories. She lived in a small flat overlooking the Thames now, under a false name, watching soldiers come home to applause. Sometimes she'd see the newsreels, smiling generals, victory speeches, factory workers waving flags, and she'd whisper, "You're all cheering for ghosts." One evening, a plain brown envelope arrived by post. No sender, no return address. Inside, a faded photograph, a group of officers at a long table. In the background stood a familiar figure, Harold Kane. He was alive. The back of the photo had a single sentence: "They never stopped lying." That night, as the rain pattered against her window, Miriam made a decision. The world deserved to know. She gathered her papers, her surviving notes, Kane's letter from 1944, and began writing the story they'd tried to bury. It would not be for the press, not yet. It would be for history. But across the Atlantic, others were making sure that history would never see daylight. Donovan's office had become a furnace of secrecy. A new government department was forming, the Office of Information Policy, tasked with controlling how the war would be remembered. It was here that the first post-war propaganda campaigns were born. Films glorifying the Allied command, speeches praising decisive leadership, even history textbooks written under military supervision. One young aide asked timidly, "Sir, what about the falsified reports? The morale operations? Shouldn't there be records?" Donovan's gaze hardened. "There are no falsified reports. There never were. There were only patriotic corrections." By the time the meeting ended, the illusion had been rewritten into fact. Weeks later, a courier arrived from Europe with a sealed package for Donovan. Inside was a letter unsigned, but the handwriting unmistakable. "Miriam's. You can erase paper," it said, "but you can't erase the dead." He read it twice, then burned it without a word. Still, her name began appearing in whispers, in obscure European papers, among disillusioned officers, in the hidden corners of post-war journalism. A woman claiming to possess evidence of a massive wartime deception. Most dismissed her as a crank. Others weren't so sure. In the summer of 1947, Harold Kane resurfaced in Lisbon. Rumor had it he'd escaped custody during a prisoner transfer, vanishing into the chaos of post-war Europe. Some said he worked for a newspaper now. Others claimed he was dead. But one thing was certain: someone had been leaking fragments of the truth. A British columnist published a shocking claim that American military officials fabricated entire fronts to maintain wartime morale. The article disappeared within days. The editor resigned mysteriously, but the story didn't die. It spread quietly, passed from journalist to journalist, like a ghost whispering through the ruins. And always, the same two names appeared: Kane and Shaw. One cold night, in a dim cafe in Geneva, the two met for the first time since the war. Miriam looked older, tired, but her eyes still carried that fire. Kane's face was gaunt, his voice rough from years of hiding. "They're rewriting everything," she said. "They're teaching lies in schools." He nodded. "I've seen the new archives. They call it curated truth." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Miriam leaned forward. "What if we publish it all? The letters, the documents, your reports. What if we make sure the world knows what really happened?" Kane hesitated. "You don't understand. It's not just about the past anymore. They're using the same system, the same machines. The morale division didn't end. It changed names." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He glanced around, lowering his voice. "They're building something new. A network. Information control on a global scale, not just for war, for peace, too. They call it psychological stabilization. Miriam sat back, the weight of his words settling like fog between them. So the illusion never stopped, she whispered. He looked at her and said quietly, "It just found new enemies, the truth, and anyone who dares to tell it." That night, as they parted, Kane pressed a small envelope into her hand. "If I don't make it out again, keep this safe." Inside were pages of typed reports, copies he had hidden during the war, proof of the fake victories, the altered communications, the orders to fabricate morale operations, the very evidence the generals had spent years erasing. But Miriam never got the chance to publish them. 2 days later, Kane was found dead in his hotel room. Official cause, heart failure. The same morning, her flat in London was broken into again. The papers were gone. The government issued no statements. The press never covered his death. And yet, a month later, a single envelope arrived at a London newspaper. Inside was a note, unsigned, written in a familiar hand. "History will repeat what we feed it." But somewhere, beneath the noise, the truth is still breathing. The editor hesitated for hours before deciding not to print it. He locked the letter in a drawer instead. Years later, when the Cold War began, that same drawer was found sealed shut in an abandoned newsroom. The letter still inside, the words still legible. By then, the fake victories of World War II were already immortalized in textbooks, films, and archives. Generals became legends. Failures became lessons in courage. The illusion had triumphed. But every lie, no matter how buried, leaves echoes, and somewhere in the endless stacks of forgotten war records, under dust and secrecy, a faded document still waits, stamped with 2 words that history tried to erase. Field confirmed. The same phrase that started it all, and whoever finds it next might finally have to decide whether the truth is worth the cost of believing it.